Hey, what's going on guys? It's your boy, NerdModeOn, and today I want to talk with you guys about the tanks in Battlefield 1 and the impact they will have upon the battlefield. Now before we get too far into the video, I want to quickly talk a little bit about some of the primary tanks that are going to be at the forefront of many players when it comes down to Battlefield 1, considering that there are some differences between Battlefield 1 as well as Battlefield 4. So starting things off, some of the primary tanks that you as a player might heavily find yourself using is the FT-17 tank, the A7V, and last but not least, the Mark IV tank. Now I also want to briefly talk a little bit about these particular vehicles that I just talked about, considering that they do have interesting attributes that I think you as a player might find really interesting. The FT-17 tank is a single personnel vehicle. Now as a result, this vehicle is heavily focused on destroying players as well as destroying other vehicles on the map. Now since this vehicle is heavily outfitted to have lots of armaments, especially when it comes down to killing players and ultimately destroying vehicles, this ultimately means that it does not have the ability to transport infantry players. Now of course, if you're looking for a vehicle that is going to facilitate the transportation of infantry, then you're going to want to heavily focus on the A7V, considering that it is a vehicle that has the ability to transport infantry and also provides players with weapons to utilize while they are transported around. Now recently at Gamescom we did have the ability to see this particular vehicle outfitted with a few flamethrowers, which may actually be very effective at taking city maps, considering that there is a confinement of buildings as well as these players will be able to shoot the flames into those buildings. Now of course, previous to Gamescom we did have the ability to see this particular vehicle outfitted with nothing but machine guns, and as a due result that will still be more than effective at killing infantry players, considering that they are nothing but flesh beings. Now transferring right along to the Mark IV tank, of course this is a tank that does have the ability to have some front-facing cannons, so ultimately this will be very effective at destroying the FT-17, especially if you are coordinating with the gunners. Now likewise, this vehicle also has a very interesting track system, considering that it may have the ability to traverse over trenches, which may yield to be very beneficial on certain maps in the upcoming Battlefield title. However, it hasn't necessarily been confirmed if this is going to be a feature that's available to all tanks or if it's unique only to the Mark IV tank. However, it is worth noting that unfortunately the Mark IV tank, like the FT-17 tank, does not have the ability to transport infantry players, so of course you're going to heavily rely on your gunners and not so much about having the ability to offload infantry units. So now that we've elaborated on the tanks in Battlefield 1, I want to take this time to talk a little bit about some of the missing countermeasures, especially considering that Battlefield 1 is going back to World War I while Battlefield 4 was set in a modern era. In Battlefield 1, there are some notable absences, especially when it comes down to the countermeasures and the ability to destroy tanks in a timely manner. Unfortunately, in Battlefield 1, we will not see the adoption of any rocket launchers, considering that they haven't been necessarily developed in the fashion that many of us are used to. Now, Battlefield 1 will be pushing infantry to get a lot closer to vehicles, considering that there isn't necessarily going to be a whole lot that's going to be able to lock onto these vehicles, especially at range, considering that there will also not be any lock-on weapons, such as the Javelin. Battlefield 1 is going to have a heavy emphasis on mines and anti-tank grenades, considering that in this particular time period, rocket launchers and lock-on weapons have not necessarily been developed into the fashion that we are used to. So of course the emphasis is again going to be on mines, anti-tank grenades, and some other weapons that have been showcased in some of the trailers as well as some of the live footage that maybe you guys have been watching, but for the most part there will be alternatives to taking out vehicles. Now considering that we are having a time period shift from modern setting all the way back to World War I, of course the countermeasures that were readily available during this time period are a lot different than Battlefield 4. In Battlefield 4, for example, you do have things such as active protection as well as reactive armor, and for the most part, I don't believe that active protection by any means will be returning. However, it is unlikely that reactive armor will come back in a fashion that is similar to what we have in Battlefield 4, but as of the moment, it's neither been confirmed nor denied, so of course we will have to wait and see if it does return in a fashion that's similar to Battlefield 4. Now, since the Battlefield franchise is returning to the past, of course we do not have the adoption of helicopters during this time period, considering that they have not been fully developed during this particular time. Now, as a result, tanks don't necessarily have a direct vehicle counter, considering that helicopters in Battlefield 4 were the counter to tanks, considering that they did have the armaments to supply a lot of damage to these particular vehicles. However, due to the limitations of the time period, it looks like planes are actually going to be the vehicle of choice, considering that they do have some presets that are going to be very effective at taking out vehicles. But of course, notably, this is going to be a little bit different from Battlefield 4, considering that jets usually were really good about taking out helicopters, and you had this really cut and dry system about which vehicles were good in particular situations. However, in the current system, it does look like planes are going to kind of be merged into two classes, considering that planes are going to have attributes of the jet class as well as attributes of a helicopter class. So now that we've talked about some of the differences from Battlefield 4 to Battlefield 1, I would like to talk about some of the performance differences, especially when it comes down to the tank class. Now, as of the moment, tanks are actually a really time-sensitive subject, considering that at the moment they're extremely powerful in the eyes of some particular players. However, you do have two groups in this particular case. You have players that look at the tanks and go, wow, they are extremely overpowered and they need to be nerfed. Or you have the opposite side of the spectrum where you have players that are saying that the tanks are actually in a really good position, considering that they are tanks and they should be very powerful against infantry players. So of course, if we take a look at all of the available content in the pre-alpha as well as the Gamescom footage that was recently announced and shown, of course it would seem like tanks are extremely powerful due to the limitations of the content that has been available. However, it is worth noting that all of the available content that has been shown has been showcasing these vehicles in a very limited aspect. Now, as a result of these vehicles being showcased in particular presets or not necessarily having all of the full content readily available to every single player, of course it would seem like vehicles in Battlefield 1 are extremely powerful. However, as a community, we need to realize that this is particular showcasings of vehicles with only certain attachments, as well as the infantry players don't necessarily have all of the available equipment in order to deal with these vehicles. Up until the footage at Gamescom, there was no such thing as dynamite, considering that that was not available during the first go-around of footage that was available to everybody to witness. So ultimately, I would recommend for everybody to just kind of wait until more information has been released, considering that I'm sure we're only seeing a few of the options that are available, and ultimately I'm sure there'll be a lot more options, especially about taking out tanks in particular. The effectiveness of these particular tanks seems to really excel at the ranges and the engagements that they were designed for. And as a result, the primary and secondary weapons are a lot more competitive than they have ever been in the previous editions of the Battlefield titles. Now, couple the advancements of the primary and secondary weapons being a lot more competitive in Battlefield 1 than they have been in the past, with the inability for infantry players to engage targets at medium and long range. This alteration and heavy emphasis on how vehicles should be played ultimately determines how vehicles will have an impact on the battlefield and the emphasis that they will ultimately have in particular settings. Now, if a player decides to spawn into a tank, of course his role on the battlefield is going to be primarily subjected to only repairing and using vehicles. And as a result, if you have an inexperienced driver or a player that decides to extend himself too far into an enemy position, of course he is also going to be dealt with quite a bit of damage as a due result. Now in Battlefield 1, there has been an introduction of vehicle animations, which no longer allows players to teleport right into a vehicle, considering that that was pretty ridiculous in the first place. Now couple this with the ability to repair from within the vehicle while using this particular class, you will be granted with a benefit in this particular area. However, you do not have the ability to move while this process is occurring. Likewise, if you decide to leave the vehicle, as of the moment there is no immediate animation that is going to be portrayed. However, you do extend yourself to being shot by other players or just having grenades ultimately thrown at you. So ultimately, when it really comes down to it, Battlefield 1 is going to shake the core mechanics that many players are accustomed to for the Battlefield series. However, this heavy adoption for segregating the classes into their particular roles should ultimately make the Battlefield a lot more fleshed out in the end and should really allow players to have a better grasp upon what they really need when it comes down to spawning in. But anyway guys, that's really all the information I have for you. I hope you found something in the video entertaining or insightful, but until the next episode guys, this has been NMO, and I'm going to be signing out guys. Peace!